Okay, welcome back. So, as we're perceiving, we're giving stability, structure, and meaning to the information that's coming to us from the outside. We're doing that, we're giving stability by selecting certain information. We then give it structure by organizing that information. And lastly, we give it meaning by interpreting that information. And we can conceive of the perception process then unfolding in those three stages. It's important to remember that while we could think of it as happening in this order, we're really doing these activities simultaneously. That is, as we are selecting and attending to certain stimulus, we're already starting to organize and interpret it. And we're kind of in an ongoing process of interpretation and shaping our understanding of the world. We're going to dig into each of these three activities of the perception process and try to illustrate them, and then we'll conclude. So let's start with the very first step in the perception process, selection. When we are selecting, we're dealing with a reality that there's so much information coming to us from the outside that we cannot possibly process all the sensory data that we're receiving. So we're in a situation where we have to ignore a bunch of it, and luckily we can attend to and select a portion of it to focus on and make more meaningful. And we do that both voluntarily and involuntarily, giving our attention to certain stimulus. We give our attention sometimes when the environment demands it, but oftentimes because of some internal condition. We give it attention to certain messages based on our needs, our desires, what interests us, and what we're expecting to encounter before we enter into a situation. Also, generally speaking, we are trying to select and attend to information that will reduce our feelings of uncertainty that we might be having. We want to understand what's going on, so we seek out information that will help us reduce our uncertainty. So I want to kind of illustrate the selection process in a fun little activity here. In a second, I'm going to ask you to count how many F's, the letter F's, you see in the following sentence. And let's try to see what happens. I'm going to give you about, let's say, 10 seconds to do this activity. And hopefully this works out. So here we go. Count how many F's in the following sentence. 9, 1,000, 10, 1,000. Okay, so I gave you a lot of time there. That's 10 seconds. How many of you got 3? Yeah? All right. Well, you're wrong. That's not how many were there. How many of you got 4? I do this in my classes, and most people get 4 F's. So you're wrong again. So you're going to need to count again. The right answer is 6. There are 6 F's in this sentence, and if I hurried you enough, I might have tripped some of you up. A lot of times when my students do this, they just skim right over the UBs. Our mind, when it's dealing with a lot in a short amount of time, is forced to kind of prioritize. And over the years, we've just learned to ignore certain parts of sentences. And so it's not uncommon for people to not see these little words when they're reading quickly. Maybe you've experienced this when you were editing your own papers. So hopefully that had the effect. Hard to know when you're not here to give me immediate feedback. So that illustrates the idea of selection. The next step in the perception process is organization. Once we've attended to and selected certain stimulus to pay attention to, then we start sorting and categorizing that information. And this is going to happen pretty immediately as we encounter new messages. And it's oftentimes going to happen at a pretty unconscious level. Our mind's going to immediately associate certain things with pre-existing patterns that exist in our minds. And those patterns we could call schemata. And our mind is going to use some innate schemata, that is to say that we're born with some ability to organize information as babies. For example, we can see faces pretty early on. And it also explains why we tend to see faces in things like the light sockets or in the tiles on the floor of the bathroom. And so we are given some schemata. I'll talk about the difference between schema and schemata in the next slide. But we use some patterns, some cognitive thought patterns called schemata that are pre-programmed, and we also learn a whole bunch of them throughout our lives as we are raised by our parents and begin to interact with others in society and the world. Okay, so I want to illustrate the idea of how the mind immediately begins to organize information. Can you read this? So it says, only smart people can read this. I couldn't believe that I could actually understand what I was reading. So most likely you are able to read this, and it's because the mind is organizing this information in a way to relate it to patterns that already exist in your mind. And just by looking at sort of the beginning of the sentence, the first letter, and the last letter of the sentence, and then just seeing some of the other letters, they don't have to be in order, your mind's able to recognize and associate that mix of letters with the correct word. Right? So this is pretty legible to most people, and you can read about that there. So we're going to use certain schemata in social situations for what we might call social perceptions. Social perceptions are those perceptions that we have of ourselves and others as we interact with them. And we're going to develop our social perception by using certain patterns of thinking or certain schemata. And before I move on, many schemata is plural for a single schema. Okay, so I wanted to clarify that. So we have lots of different schemata. We have schemata that we might call prototypes, and that's the librarian that you see here. We have an image of kind of an ideal type of person, the kind of person with certain characteristics that we would expect of them. And we could call those prototypes in their most innocent form. There's a word stereotypes, which is kind of like taking prototypes but making them negative or cultural. And stereotypes, we tend to think of them as trying to explain the behavior of individuals by their group membership. And so don't worry so much about trying to distinguish between the two. On the quizzes, I'm not going to ask you about that. Prototype doesn't have that connotation. It just means a general type. However, any prototype could become a stereotype as well. Okay. So that's the librarian over there is our person prototype. We also have personal constructs. Each of us has certain ways of describing the qualities of people that we carry around inside our heads. And so over there on the right, you see the word lame. And I remember when I was substitute teaching, the students that I worked with would call, things either cool or lame, basically. And so they had kind of these, or people they would call cool or lame, and they had these narrow kind of constructs for thinking about people, and they use them constantly to describe people. So the more personal constructs we have, the more variety and kinds of people and qualities in people that we start to see in them. So personal constructs are kind of like adjectives or descriptors for the qualities we tend to see and use to describe certain people. Scripts deal with action sequences. They are a pattern of action that we use in social situations, like, say, ordering a Big Mac from McDonald's, right? There's a certain script, a certain order in which those actions occur, and we're going to rely on those patterns to understand what's happening, to perceive what's going on in a social situation, and to guide our own behavior. And that's basically organization in a nutshell. We're going to have certain patterns in our minds that we're going to use to organize the new information that we're getting. And that brings us to the last step, interpretation, the last step of the perception process. And interpretation is where we're going to assign meaning. And this is I tend to think of this as being more deliberate and conscious effort that's being done. So this happens after we've received a stimulus, experienced it, done that first initial kind of organization of it, and now we're starting to think more deeply about it. We're trying to understand what's happening. One of the ways we do this is just by telling ourselves the story of what happened. So we're going to use a kind of narrative understanding of the world to interpret it. We're going to tell ourselves the story. And we might tell ourselves the story from our point of view. We might try to tell the story from other people's points of view as well. We're going to also, in the interpretation phase, be asking critical questions, about what we came to understand. Did I correctly understand what happened? Could I be mistaken in some ways? Maybe this isn't a personal trait of this person that's caused this misunderstanding. Maybe it's a cultural misunderstanding. So this is where we do some perception checking and try to question in a more deep fashion what we've come to understand. And in doing so, we're going to possibilize different meanings of what happened, and we're also going to some extent, decide upon a working meaning for ourselves on at least two different levels. One, we're going to try to understand the meaning of the content of the exchange. What was said, what was meant to be said. And then we're also going to be asking ourselves relational questions. We're going to take some meaning from this interaction about our relationship to this other person. Were they treating me well? Am I treating them well? Is our relationship good? Is our relationship bad? So we're going to get a content message in interpretation, and we're going to come to a understanding of the relational messages that we received in an interaction. And we're going to talk more about these things in upcoming videos and in the course readings. And as we dig deeper into what we're going to think of as social perception, how we make sense out of ourselves and how we make sense out of other people. And we'll talk a little bit more about common misinterpretations that occur in social perception. So, want to summarize? Perception occurs in 3 steps. When we select, we attend to a certain part of reality and give that part of reality some stability. When we organize, we sort and categorize what we have selected. We begin to structure that stimulus, and we interpret, we assign deeper meanings. Thank you for listening. Sorry for the awkward end to this video.